Hey there riders, Journo Kris here today with MotoHub's CL500 demo bike. This is the new Honda Scrambler and I thought I'd give you a quick test insight into what this bike's like as I've spent the morning testing it and I've come away quite impressed. Obviously the Honda 500 options cover a huge variety of choices for new riders. The Rebel 500 is a cruiser and that is what the CL500 is based on. So rather than going from a roadster and turning it into a scrambler, what Honda have done is they've gone from a cruiser and converted that into a scrambler. Now that's not going to be for everyone, and particularly because we're looking at a beginner-centric machine that kind of extends up into that intermediate area. There's a lot of reasons why using the Rebel 500 as the basis was a really good idea, and I think it's a great machine. It's a little bit different than perhaps what I expected. It is very, very different than my Svartpilen 401, and I'll do a separate comparison video talking about the differences between the two bikes on that. However, it is in its own right a really cool machine, particularly people who like a lot of the appeal of the Rebel 500 but just aren't a cruiser person, because not everyone is. Let's start with the engine and move on from there. This is the 500 or 473cc parallel twin. Obviously, it is a torquier engine. It's more refined than the single options, and I would say parallel twins are a much better option than four in the restricted market, where this isn't a restricted engine. I think they've just tuned it to meet kind of that 35 kilowatt expectation in Europe, which certainly fits within our LAMS restrictions here in Australia. But at the same time, it is a bike that doesn't feel restricted. It's got beautiful mid-range torque. That first little bit of throttle opening is quite smooth as well. It is not the smoothest fueling, I will say, because it's got that really nice mid-range torque. And jumping off something like the Transalp yesterday, I did notice that having the engine brake control was quite a bit smoother. However, as far as the entry-level machines, I think it's well up to par with most of the competition and will certainly be a very rewarding machine to ride. It's a little bit more relaxed, again, coming back to that kind of cruiser theme, and it's very torquey through that mid-range, and so you will be relying on kind of using that to get the most out of it. 6-speed gearbox, so it's not like you're stuck with a little 5-speed gearbox, which can be quite disappointing. No, you've got a nice broad spread of power. You've got no tacho, but you don't really need it. You're going to work off feel on a bike like this. And while the cruiser side of things is very, very strong indeed with this particular motorcycle, for out cruising the roads, it was a great thing. A little bit more relaxed, a little bit kind of more laid back than some of the competition. But at the same time, that works for me. Of course, that is probably not always going to be the best thing if you're someone looking at a really serious off-road scrambler. However, I think if you're really looking for that, this is probably not the bike, and I would go as far as to say most of the scramblers out of the box are quite basic in that regard. So you're not really losing out too much there. Having a look at the braking systems, that's one of the areas which I did feel was, again, very cruiser influenced, where on a sports bike or even a roadster, I think we would generally say 90% of your braking performance is on the front. The front setup on this doesn't have an enormous amount of bite and doesn't have an enormous amount of power. You're very much using both the front and the rear together to bring the bike to a halt, and you're going to be using the gearbox as well to achieve that. I think in downshifting through the gears to get as much deceleration and braking performance as you can. And I would say probably the performance on the front brake is a little bit more disappointing than I perhaps expected. It's still within reason and it's still going to suit a new rider very, very well because it's a very forgiving brake system. But again, it's much more like a cruiser where a lot more of the braking performance is to the rear of the bike. Moving on to the suspension, I will say that in suburban conditions, I was getting a bit of dive on the forks if I used that front brake a little bit hard, which I do acknowledge. I just said the front brake's not that powerful. But once I got out into the open road and was moving a little bit more, and certainly I was taking a more kind of flowing approach to how I was riding, I wasn't getting heavy on the brakes before each corner. The bike lends itself to a much more flowing approach. I did find that the suspension setup was really good, and those dual rear shocks certainly did the job as well. You're only getting preload adjustability, so it's a more basic suspension setup, but for me at 75 kilos plus probably 10 kilos in gear, it was pretty much ideal. It was comfortable, it was well supported, can't complain about the front end, very hard to complain about the rear end as well. Just did everything well, so I was quite impressed there. And again, I guess we'll go back to the fact that this is based on a Rebel 500, And the next thing we're going to talk about is kind of the handling and the ergonomics, and those are very cruiser inspired as well. So let's talk handling first up. Obviously, again, it's got that taller front end and it's got the larger 19-inch front wheel, and it does give the bike, again, a bit more of that cruiser kind of feel to it with a lower and shorter rear ends as far as the balance of the bike. It's a much more front-endy feel to the bike as well. So certainly your inputs at the front end are probably going to be a little bit more exaggerated compared to a more balanced roadster. But that's certainly no problem whatsoever. And it's not like it's got a heavy front end. It's not like a cruiser where it's a little bit stodgy in the handling department and really requires quite a bit of force to get it through the corners and to really corner well. That is not the case. Quite the opposite. It's quite a natural handler, but that larger front wheel does give it a more arcing, kind of natural cornering line. And as a result of that, I just took that in my stride, was a little bit more relaxed in how I handled the bike, and it did a really, really good job. But it is different than something a little bit sportier, which would be running, say, dual 17s. Of course, because we're talking a Scrambler, you probably want the larger front wheel for the gravel, and certainly the little bits of gravel I did today, it worked really, really well. And that tire choice, that dual purpose tire, was actually a nice compromise. It worked really well. It was a little bit damp and there was a lot of rubbish on the road today, and I was really confident on the bike. I was really happy with that. And I think it's just a nice all-round combination, which, you know, it does again fall back to being that little bit cruiserish with that taller front end and the taller bars and the lower rear, but it's not quite as low at the rear. It's a little bit nicer balanced than a cruiser, and that shows in both the ergonomics and the handling, which are certainly what I'd be hoping for in a bike like this, and kind of reminds me a little bit of like the XSR700 and the W800, kind of those slightly more relaxed machines, perhaps not as relaxed as the W800 and not quite as sporty as the XSR700, but a nice midpoint there where the cruiser characteristics have been used really well and converted into a very good scrambler option, I guess you'd say. And that certainly carries across to the overall handling characteristic. This is probably not a bike I would be kind of riding as hard as I might my Sparkpillen 401. I think I'd take it a little bit easier. I think it's a little bit more relaxed overall. That's just the style of the bike, whether we're talking the engine, the handling characteristics, the brakes, the ergos, and it's very rewarding to do that. So if you're not someone who wants quite a sporty scrambler, particularly when we're talking the road side of things, I think this is probably going to be a winner for you and probably something that you should really consider. So as far as the ergonomics on the CL500, I'm going to have a full separate video which goes into a bit more depth, but we'll have a quick look here because I think it is kind of an important feature. Obviously, it's not the lightest bike, and that was one of the complaints that came out when kind of this bike was announced. I think it's around the 200 kilo mark, so it is heftier. However, at the same time, because it's based on a cruiser which has a lower seat height and a low center of gravity, despite the tank looking and being a little bit higher, it's a very, very manageable machine. It's a very easy machine to ride. It's, as I said, has a nice low center of gravity, which means that it's not as top heavy. So for newer riders or people who are a bit worried about kind of the height of the bike and the weight of the bike and the seat height, it's going to be one of the most manageable machines I think you're going to find in the category. And it's probably going to be one of the most manageable machines you'll find without going to a cruiser, which tend to be the lowest options. And when we look at the Rebel 500 in comparison to this, I think it has a lower seat height, but for some people, they don't want it quite that low. And this is a good compromise in between that cruiser style and a more roadster style. So reach to the bars. Obviously, it's a very relaxed upright seating position, good vision of the dash and mirrors, taller-ish bars, which kind of work for me. There's a little bit more of a stretch out to the bars rather than a bend, which would get you in a sportier position. But because there's so much room in the cockpit here, you can get really engaged and kind of use that space if that's what you're after. I don't really think it's that style of bike. I think it's a bit more of a relaxed bike, and you'll probably just be having fun in a pretty upright seating position. The seat itself is a little bit narrower than what we see on the cruisers, but it's got that more bench style seat, which does help keep the seat height down, but it's not as sculpted and large as a cruiser seat. So you might lose a tiny bit of comfort there. The dash itself, I do find the reflections onto the dash do affect my ability to see kind of what speed I'm doing. It's a very, very simple dash. There's no tacho. So as a result of that, there is a gear indicator, but it's quite a simple dash which suits the overall look of the bike. But if you're expecting lots of tech and stuff like that, you're not going to get it on this machine. There's just ABS, and I don't think there's even off-road ABS as far as I know. It's just a simple ABS system. Very simple controls as well. Non-adjustable levers, which is a bit disappointing. I think the levers should be adjustable on a slightly more expensive bike like this, being the 500 from Honda. And good mirrors. Yeah, overall everything else is pretty good. Obviously a rubber clad peg, which is nice to see. I didn't really notice any vibrations. And then there's the nice narrow tank, which is something I really do notice jumping on the bike. I think maybe as a new rider, you'll jump on and kind of feel like it's quite a large machine. But actually, I think it's quite the opposite. It's actually quite a small and manageable machine, all things considered. And it's very easy to grab onto that tank if you need to, which I didn't particularly find I needed to. Nice kind of reach from the seat down to those pegs. Obviously, because you're not a cruiser, you don't have forward controls or anything like that. So it's a little bit more compact in that stretch, but I've got longer legs, a 32-inch inseam, and I find it very comfortable. So hopefully that will work for you as well. And I will say that standing up on the bike really wasn't something that was particularly easy to do, because those bars are a little bit low and I'd have to be quite crouched over. And again, I think it's more of like quite a casual scrambler as opposed to a real hardcore off-road scrambler, if that makes sense. And you just do need to be realistic when we're considering bikes like this. And again, kind of the comparison point to the Svartbilen 401, it's not particularly easy to stand on that either, because again, I'm kind of crouched down. And so it's a criticism that I'd say, from what I've seen, is pretty widely attributable to everything in the segment. The one thing I will say is, if you're a shorter rider or perhaps a female rider who is looking for a bike which is a little bit more manageable, and perhaps you've had a cruiser suggested to you because of the low seat height, low center of gravity, and the more manageable package, I think the CL500 is going to be a winner there as well, if that's what you're looking for. Obviously, if you're a much taller rider and you're a bit more confident about handling the weight of a bike, it's probably going to be less of a concern, but that's still a real strength of this machine as far as being very accessible. And yeah, again, part of that is kind of the cruiser side of things, because it's the lower seat height and the low center of gravity. But overall, I do think it's just quite an accessible machine. Certainly bridging that gap between the cruiser and the roadster. Okay, so final thoughts on the CL500. Obviously, this is the MotoHub demo bike, so go check it out in person or go organize a test ride if you're quite interested in the bike. I think it's a cool machine. Obviously, the tall exhaust is something we don't see as much these days. The fork gate is a little bit more common, but a nice little touch. The seat, very much in the style. While it is basically a Rebel 500 that's been modified to suit the Scrambler theme, and certainly if you look at the bikes side by side, you'll notice how close they are. I personally think the CL500 is the much more attractive option to me, but I'm not a real cruiser person either. So while I can appreciate a cruiser, it's probably not my first choice. And as a result, between those two models, particularly the CL500 is a huge winner in my mind. I think because these do carry a bit more of a premium price, being both a Honda and a 500, that is probably the one sticking point for me. They don't have the tech. However, little details would be good, like adjustable levers when you're talking about a 10-gram bike here in Australia, obviously. And while there's no spoked wheels, I don't really think that's a big concern. I don't think this is a Scrambler which is designed to really do the hard off-road stuff. It's more just, you know, a typical modern kind of entry-level machine where they've taken a bit of a styling theme and they've offered a bike which just has that little bit of an edge over a typical road bike when it comes to doing gravel roads or a little bit of light off-roading, and that certainly does work if you ask me. But anyway, let me know what you think of the CL500. I think it's actually quite an impressive machine, despite obviously some of the shortcomings that people have highlighted in the criticisms. I think Honda have offered something just that little bit different, which is going to be a winner for the right rider, which is what it's all about at the end of the day. Every bike is not going to be good for everyone. As I said, you can go check out this bike at MotoHub in Castle Hill in Sydney, and I'd certainly recommend doing that if you're interested in the bike. Maybe even just go in and have a sit on one, check it out compared to the Rebel 500. They've got the CB500X in there as well that you can also have a look at if you're interested in something a little bit more hardcore in the off-roading, kind of the adventure side of things. And yeah, see how you go. Any questions, ask me down below in the comments. As always, stay safe out there. Thanks for watching.